Welcome to the VO2 Lounge. In this episode we will be diverting from the normal episode type where we talk about athletic performance and physiology and so on and so forth, and just generally how to make you a faster, stronger and healthier athlete. In this episode I'm going to be providing a race recap of my first cycling road race of the season. I know this will mainly engage cyclists, but maybe some other endurance athletes may find this of use and find this interesting in how I prepared, lessons I've learned, how I go about reviewing my races, and how I plan to go forward in the race season. I'm going to cover the kind of basics of race time and distance, race format, race metrics like normalized power and average power, training status in the lead up to this race, like what sort of intervals I had I done any intervals, and then a general waffle on how I went and what I have learned so far in this season. So let's get into it. The race was a handicap style race with 5 groups, the 5th group being the scratch group. Now what the actual time splits were, I'm not sure 100%, but it was enough that for the scratch group, spoiler alert, they didn't win. It could have been a cracking effort if they did, but I'm guessing 2-minute intervals between groups, so that's an 8-minute gap from the first group to the scratch group. Could have even been 3 minutes for the first group because that had a lot of new riders to racing, and the way this club seemed to be running things was they were trying to get a lot of their new riders who have maybe done group rides but not a lot of road racing to get into that scene and take their first steps. And then there were some people returning who hadn't road raced in 5-6 years, so it was a general real mix. You had new riders completely to road racing, you had returning riders, you had 4th cats, you had 3rd cats, you had 2nd cat riders, you had some women who are not sure exactly what category they were, but you also had some under 23s and also some junior riders in general. For those that don't know, a handicap race essentially splits riders up based on rider cat or some other form of performance skill metric and gives a time advantage to who are thought to be the slower individuals. As I've said, we had 4th cats, juniors, women, 3rd cats and 2nd cats, which I'm not sure how they got in, as I thought from at least the British Cycling website, it was 3rd cats as being the highest. Definitely not complaining, it definitely added some spice to the race, but it sounds like they may be friends of the club and were brought in unofficially once the numbers were not met. The maximum number of riders is 80, I believe, and we had about 65 riders, so a pretty good field, to be honest. Now, the race was 3 laps of what is apparently quite a common TT, a time trial circuit, of 14.88 kilometers or 9.3 miles, but it came to about 44 kilometers or 28 miles for the total race, taking an hour and 6 minutes, so 43 kilometers an hour average for my group at least, which I'll go on to say how that went, with 326 meters of climbing. So it was pretty flat for the most part. The race started somewhere roughly around the highest point of elevation. You then just had a gradual descent, some rolling sections, no real kickers. Near to the end of the lap there was maybe a 4% jab, very short, like inertia could take you over that really. And then the race finish line was the most noteworthy ascent. It was, 20 seconds long. It was again really short. As you can tell by the elevation, there wasn't really anything, but it was a little, maybe a 4%, 3% false flat sort of drag into the finish line. Now the average power I did for the race was 263 watts with a normalized power of 293 watts, and I'm an 87 kilogram rider roughly at the point of this race. And the average temperature, which is a bit not the greatest, was 3 degrees Celsius. That's Celsius, not Fahrenheit, so convert it as you wish. 2 things about this. The power was a little low originally, is what I thought, and it's what I was expecting for the most part at this point. I can explain the training a little bit more as to why I think this is in line. So coming into this season, what I found last season was that my general aerobic fitness that I had cultivated leading into the season wasn't that great, because I forcibly/unforcibly, through long commutes that I was doing at the time to work, did not have really much of a winter at all. I probably did my last noteworthy ride in November of the previous year, maybe even earlier, to be honest. I was doing 1s and 2s from about September time, maybe even August, and then do very little work, finally come to April time where I pick up riding, which is later in the year than this road race was, and then I give myself 4 weeks to get some kind of fitness cobbled together, and then I get straight into racing. So over the race season, I developed the sort of upper above threshold and threshold sort of area. Wasn't really able to actually hold that like FTP figure for that long. Simply able to respond to jabs and so on and so forth, because I didn't really do much work on that. So my aim for this season was to come in to the beginning of the season with as much steady state power capabilities as possible, which is definitely something I noticed in this race. I was able, the way a handicap race really works is it's almost like being in a breakaway or the chase group trying to actually claw the breakaway back. You're regardless of what team people are on, the people in your group or in your split are effectively your teammates, and you need to work together. You need to get effectively some kind of pace line or a chain gang going, which is what I tried to do. And through the first lap, I averaged about 283 watts trying to convince people to do work on the front and rotate. And we did a little bit, but it ended up being a few people sort of tail gunning, and then maybe 4 or 5 of us actually trying to get a rotation through, which got harder and harder to maintain the longer we went on and the less work other members of the group started doing at times. So I think a misconception can be for people that you're trying to attack your group, which some people did, may I add, whereas the reality is until you catch the lead group, you're not racing for any positions. And the purpose of races like this really is to blood people in, and then in the much bigger form races it just provides a more dynamic and a bit more jeopardy, because you don't know who's gonna win at any point, because really, if it's done well, it could be only the last few kilometers where the groups come together. In this case, the lead group was pretty much out of touch by the looks of things of anyone from the group 4 and group 5. And so maybe the time splits could do with improving, but essentially, the normalized power and average power, although they are quite far apart, aren't as far apart as some races I've had, partially probably because of that. I've had road races where I'm doing 240 watt average and then 330 watts normalized. And because of this more rolling through pattern and sitting more time on the front, the two numbers are closer together. I mean, the normalized is a bit lower than I'd expect normally from a road race. But the positive is that my time on the front felt really strong even later on. I just felt like I couldn't close gaps particularly effectively, which is understood by where my training status is. Up until this point, my focus, as I said, was to build this steady state power capability psychologically and physiologically. Holding steady state power is something that is a bit of an art form in a sense, that you need to be able to know internally what you can do on a given day rather than necessarily just looking at the power numbers. Heart rate can be useful to see where you sort of hit that point of steady state, but that was the focus. So all I've been doing is my zone 2 rides 4 to 5 times per week, and then come Saturday, go out for either 30 minutes, an hour, later even on for 2 hours, and then I reach a road where if I do the out and back, it's a total of an hour, and I slowly built up from 30 minutes to 40, 50, and then to do several efforts at around the hour mark, where I sit at 160 to 170 beats per minute and do approximately, we're talking something sub-maximal, in the realms of 260 to 280 watts. Why do I say such a broad range? Well, essentially, at the beginning of the season, I did my first attempt at this. I did 250 odd watts for only 30 minutes. My second attempt was 50 minutes long, matched the power, and then a few attempts later I finally came back out on my summer bike with the power meter, because I've got a left side crank only power meter at the moment, and my watts had jumped up to 270 watts for 40 minutes, and my assumption is from there that it's somewhere in that 270 to 280 range for the full hour. So FTP is doing well. General steady state capabilities are doing well. It's something I've never really delved into before, but now really seeing the benefit of this through my ability to, one, recover at higher loads. So when the jabs come, my ability to then ease off the pedals, but still be doing 240, 250 watts and really feel the recovery coming in, and then be able to jab again. Although the jabs that I'm giving, much less potent and frequent as they will be later in the season. But this means I've come into this first road race having almost not touched VO2 or true threshold really at all. The only VO2 session that I did, VO2 from the power training zone, is one session the Wednesday before this race, which was on a Saturday, where I did one block of 20-10 Tabata style efforts and did 10 of those in total. And that was just to open the legs up a little bit, see where that upper end was, and just to try stimulate something to feel a bit less flat, may I say, on this road race. But there's no preparing for it all the time, really, with road racing. It can be very difficult to truly replicate it in training. So with that out of the way, let's get into the actual kind of lap by lap summary of what went on. So the first lap showed some promise, as I said, with people sort of working in a chain gang to catch the next group on the road, which essentially is the aim. You catch a group, you catch a group, you catch a group. As hopefully that group builds in size, you can get turns in more frequently or at least you as an individual are doing fewer turns, but it means the turns that have been done can be more potent and you can work to catch that lead group. But that soon slowed down when effectively we didn't catch the group within 20 minutes and people seemed to grow bored of it, and it slowed down. Then as a result, a couple of us working, group must have been about 10 or 14 riders, resulted in me doing 282 watts for the first laps, which was approximately 22 minutes at this power. Now, I don't know what happened, but I think a group tried to break off and to bridge, and I had to do a 900 watt dig in there to sit at 325 watts for about 2 minutes to get back on, which is where we lost a couple of the riders. And that's what I was saying earlier. An individual attacked the group, which doesn't make sense in this kind of event. Only time you're going to really attack is once you've caught the group. So fair enough if you're going up a hill at a fair rate of knots and some people just get dispatched because they can't hang with it, and then fair enough, you've whistled them out. But through an explosive attack, it doesn't necessarily make so much sense. Now, it's important to note that this ride being so early and me having done essentially, work above even threshold, my aim was to work as a group, but also to do as much steady state work as I could as a training stimulus. Essentially, this is what was coming to it. I knew a handicap race was unlikely at this level to yield me any kind of real race results. It was just an opportunity to get that really high stimulus that you get from a race when you're in that zone and you're willing to push yourself way harder than you normally would. Lap 2 is where we get caught by the scratch group. The scratch group appeared to be a reasonable size larger than our group, because by the time it came around and swallowed us, it was like being swallowed by a whole peloton. Like, it was a pretty large group, and there was, I think, a team of 5 riders in there, and some pretty serious riders by the looks of things. They seemed to really have good legs for this time of the season. So this allowed me to sit in the wheels a little bit, but still do some work, bringing my average power down to 250 watts. There was a couple moves that spiked power, but most part, all is going well and we are moving well as a group. The finish line hill is also much easier this lap, as there is less preloading of the legs before we reach it. I'm doing not minimal, but I'm only doing maybe a turn every 2-3 minutes, even more maybe, versus a turn every minute almost when we were in the group prior. Now, lap 3 is where it sort of all goes to pot. Up until this point, we don't seem to swallow another group. I think we do swallow group 3 possibly, but I think they got split up quite a lot. It looks like people must have been attacking or just not fit enough, because there was just 1s and 2s being sort of collected as we went through and then just spat out the back. But I can think it's fairly safe to say we swallowed group 3. Now, group 2 and 1 definitely didn't swallow group 1, because no one won the race from the scratch group. But things seem to heat up a little bit anyway at this point. People either knowing that there's not going to be a win from this group, or just trying to hurry the group along. There's a few spikes and surges in effort. Now, then somewhere in and amongst here, a guy loses the wheel. I think there's a pothole. There was a particularly bad bit of tarmac. That results in me having to really surge to get on. The final real big effort. Managed to get on and stay with this group to the end. But my average for this lap is only 252 watts, very similar to lap 2. I do some work on the front, rotate a little bit, find myself on the front coming into the finish straight. And this is where my major learning, as I'm about to go through, will come up. Essentially, I'm too far to the front, do a bit too much work. It's way too hard to launch a sprint, and it just makes me get swallowed up by the group. Now, moving on to the learnings. The only takeaway really from this race are that for this time of year, it seemed to be in pretty good nick. The long steady state efforts have clearly done their work, and my steady state power, ability to keep the group rolling and recover from over FTP efforts while still at a reasonably sort of tempo or sweet spot-esque power has definitely improved, and it's looking really promising for the season and for being able to get in more breakaways. As for technique, I'll need to work definitely on my finish for a little bit, but at this level, I think you do get a mixture of how many teams there are and so on and so forth, but the group effort and work is not the most cohesive. So coming into the finish, it's not always like a World Tour race where it's flat out and the group is moving. It can be a bit on and off. There can be random slowdowns coming into that final couple of kilometers while people look at each other and don't want to work, especially if a team's lost maybe who they thought they were working for as a sprinter, and now it's sort of every man for himself, especially in this handicap race where in and amongst this group, there only seemed to be one notable team. Definitely there was a moment coming in, maybe sub a kilometre to the line, where the group really slowed down and I freewheel for a reasonable amount of time. That in reality would have been the perfect point to attack, because as soon as I get that gap and no one takes the wheel, so making sure I'm like 15th, maybe even 20th wheel back, as in maybe not quite that far, but definitely not in the front 5 wheels, to be able to launch an attack, get that momentum and that gap. Then once you've got the gap, really, it takes quite a lot of cohesion to then actually chase it down. And that looks to be the place where there's a lot to be done. Coming into the sprint, I think my just general positioning coming into the sprint isn't necessarily amazing. My sprint numbers are all right. Peaked at about 1300, 1400 last year. Again, maybe a bit heavier, maybe 88 kilos, but they're not world beating. So I think definitely where I would more stand now is the 4, 5, 6 minute kind of effort range and trying to launch that attack or trying to get a breakaway. So that is going to be my focus for this year, is if I'm there in the last lap and we're still in a group, it's definitely going to be a K or a couple Ks, or just when the group naturally slows down on that lap, attacking then, versus also trying to get in the breakaway. So what else am I going to be doing going forward? Well, definitely now that we're in the season, I do actually have a 1 week break where I'm going away on a short holiday. But when I come back, it's definitely going to be into the 3 days on, 1 day off kind of pattern, shimmying it around a little bit depending on where races are. But if I have one race in a week, then 20 10s, for example, as my additional interval. And if I have 2 races, no intensity, and then no races, 20 10s and 4 minute efforts. There may be 4 minute efforts as well, 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off, skirted in around races as well. But those are going to be the 3 primary workouts that I'm planning on having are 20 10s, 4 minutes on, either 4 minutes off or 2 minutes off, and the 8 minute efforts. They're going to be the bread and butter for a period of time while I build up that fitness. And then when we get into the thick of it, there's going to be so much racing that I'm probably not going to have the time for intervals, and it's just going to be zone 2 everywhere that isn't a race. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if it goes down well, I'll make one for most races as a training update and a practical implementation of most of what is going on and any thoughts I've had from episodes that I've already released and have now moved into my training. So feel free to leave feedback and let me know whether you want more of these. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all down below. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it is goodbye.